You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Chicago Bears got involved in the first wave of free agency, a splash signing, of defensive tackle Larry Ogunjobi, a big step forward for this defensive line in this rebuilding process of what Matt Eberflus and Ryan Poles are looking for, building from the inside out. This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Chicago Bears start free agency with Larry Ogunjobi, defensive tackle, after releasing Eddie Goldman, moving on from Khalil Mack via trade, seemingly not going to bring back Akeem Hicks. We'll see what happens. This is where Ryan Poles takes his first hit. Ogunjobi as a player, Bears defensive line, what it kind of signals about what they want to do defensively, how this fits in the free agent marketplace, paid too much fit, what other options were available, and how this whole market has started to play out. And we'll check in on some of the other big moves of free agency that didn't directly involve the Bears signing anybody. Either other players the Bears are interested in, or maybe they were interested in and got priced out of, and kind of keep track of where things are moving. Now, obviously, free agency moves kind of quickly here, and it's very possible that by the time you listen to this podcast, maybe even by the time I'm done recording it, parts of it could be outdated, new deals could be added, and things could kind of be shaken up quickly. But for now, we're going to start with more of a singular focus on Larry Ogunjobi, and whatever the Bears do next, we'll address on tomorrow's podcast. But Ogunjobi, the big spender for Ryan Poles, agreeing to a fairly significant deal here, right? I mean, this was day one of free agency, kind of putting his stamp on a player that they clearly see as a key fit in the middle of this Bears defense. And so when you look at the contract numbers coming out, 3-year deal worth $40.5 million, including $26 million guaranteed. That from Brad Biggs of the Chicago Tribune. So, we're looking at upwards of $13 million a year there for a guy like Ogunjobi. That's pretty good money there for the three technique defensive tackle spot. I think it averages out to $13.5 million. When you use the guaranteed money there of 26, that basically will mean the first 2 years will be more or less fully guaranteed. And then the third year, the team should, in theory, be able to get out of it. We haven't seen the exact structure just yet, but maybe it shouldn't be a huge surprise that this was an emphasis for them. We talked about from both defensive coordinator Alan Williams and then head coach Matt Eberflus have talked about the importance of those interior defensive tackle positions and really building this defense from the inside out, seeing as that being a particularly, specialized position and a position of the utmost importance on the interior there. Ogunjobi slots into that three technique pass rushing defensive tackle position. And he's coming off of really, I think, his best statistical season in terms of sacks, not necessarily in terms of like Pro Football Focus grading, but he was with the Cincinnati Bengals this season to help them step up their run defense particularly well. And then Ogunjobi himself put up a career high 7 sacks is what he finished with this season. He had a couple seasons of 5.5 over his first 4 years in Cleveland, but kind of got that 1 year prove it deal with Cincinnati and proved some, right? I think that's where the disconnect comes here, right? Because $13.5 million for a defensive tackle seems like a lot for any defensive tackle. And for Larry to kind of come in and not be a top tier disruptor at the defensive tackle, he's more like that B tier defensive tackle, but got paid a decent amount of money. And we kind of knew that that's how the business goes here, right? In free agency. It was something that Ryan Poles had specifically talked about at the combine when looking at that first wave of free agency. He admitted like, hey, when you get to sign these guys right out of the gate, you're going to overpay.
Yeah. So you'll start to gather that information just with contacts uh, into that first wave, and you'll get a feel based on how you valued players once they start to trickle down and the price points come down a little bit. Because at the end of the day, you're going to overpay in free agency. That's just what it is. It's market price. So um, it's really through the communication that you'll get an idea of when things settle down a little bit. But it's usually a couple days in.
I think for Ryan Poles, clearly the three technique position was so important to he and Eberflus that they felt like they needed to go out and get someone and maybe overpay a bit for someone like Larry Ogunjobi. I mean, right? He's still a young enough defensive lineman here at age 27, turns 28 this offseason, but 5 years into his career that there's potential for him to continue to get better and improve. And I think he's a fairly potentially well-rounded type of three technique, right? He's not just the shoot the gap and be a pass rusher type guy, but he is a big physical. I mean, he's a 300-pound man that can hold up at times in the gaps. The problem is, like when you look at his Pro Football Focus grades, for example, they've gone down every year since his rookie season. He goes from a 78.4 as a rookie down to now a 47.6 this past season. And the run defense is where things have been lacking a little bit more than the pass rushing, which is less important for that three technique spot, but still going to be important for what they need from him at that spot. He also missed a number of tackles this season that were a little bit concerning, but I think part of the value from Larry Ogunjobi comes in his durability and reliability that a lot of times, defensive tackles, interior defensive linemen don't end up playing a ton of snaps overall. They tend to like rotate a little bit more at those spots, and you don't get as many snaps from those guys as you do like snaps. But Ogunjobi is a guy who every season has played at least 600 snaps since his rookie. Every season as a starter, he's had 930 snaps, 779, 642, and 724. He's playing out of maybe about 1,000 snaps a year. He's playing that 64 to 90% of the snaps every season. You're getting more snaps per dollar out of Ogunjobi than you are maybe some other interior defensive tackle guys, and he's been able to hold up through all of that. So I think they value a lot of the intangible traits there that somebody like Ogunjobi is going to bring in, even when the Pro Football Focus grades and some of the on-field stuff might not necessarily match with the full $13.5 million salary that the Bears are paying for him. Understanding that it's always going to feel like an overpay when you start free agency. We'll look kind of more specifically at how much of an overpay that might be compared to what other defensive tackles are making, what other free agent options were available, and what the Bears' plans are going to be on that defensive line next on Locked On Bears. Free agency is a lot of fun to keep tabs on, and it can be even more fun if you lay some money down on where some of these players are going to end up with our friends at BetOnline. They've got all the latest odds, contests, and player props. BetOnline.net is the number one sports source for all of your sports betting needs and information, not just free agency, but the draft coming up. You can bet over under on where prospects are going to go or how many players at each position are going to go in the first round. Plus, college basketball tournament season, BetOnline is the top spot for all of the madness all month long. Not just football, not just basketball, soccer, hockey, tennis, boxing, all your sports wagering needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games online. Plus, we have a Major League Baseball season finally coming around the corner so that you can get your baseball futures bets into. Head on over to betonline.net today or use your mobile device to learn all about the different trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The concern or the upset Bears fans, I think, always start in this conversation with the salary cap number, right? There's nothing specifically against Larry Ogunjobi as a player, but when you get to the $13 million a year range, it can feel a little bit high for a player that's not necessarily totally proven as an every down dominant interior disruptor, right? He's not. I mean, Aaron Donald's never a fair comparison, right? But if we take out Aaron Donald out of the mix, but like if you start sort of ranking your interior defensive tackles, right? I'm not gonna power rank them all, but you have these different tiers, right? Some of the guys at the top, you think like Kenny Clark from Green Bay, Chris Jones from the Chiefs, Jonathan Allen from Washington, maybe Fletcher Cox from the Eagles, Grady Jarrett from the Falcons, right? All those guys are more consistent, true disruptors. And it feels like Larry Ogunjobi is like another tier down, right? He's more like the Javon Hargrave, Dalvin Tomlinson, Michael Pierce, Shelby Harris type guys. And that's where the free agent market value play comes in here, right? That the Bears didn't pay Larry Ogunjobi, Chris Jones, Jonathan Allen money, right? Those guys, I mean, Aaron Donald, for example, is making $22 million, as he should. DeForest Buckner from the Colts, Matt Eberflus, who traded for Buckner and made that a priority acquisition for them, the 3 technique, kind of doing the same thing here in Chicago with a lesser tier in Ogunjobi, but Buckner is getting $21 million a year. Chris Jones in Kansas City gets 20. Jonathan Allen gets 18. Vita Vea 17.75. Kenny Clark 17.5. And then Fletcher Cox and Grady Jarrett are both at 17. Cameron Hayward at 16. Then there's a jump, and Larry Ogunjobi is actually now the 10th highest paid defensive tackle in terms of average salary per year, down at 13.5, right? So the next player above Ogunjobi is Cameron Hayward of the Steelers at 16.5. So almost a $3 million gap there between Ogunjobi and Hayward in a per year basis. So basically, they made Ogunjobi the highest paid of like that second tier of defensive tackles. And like all things considered, that's not terrible, right? I mean, yes, when you sign a free agent, they generally want to be, I mean, obviously they want to make as much money as they can, but they kind of end up sort of paying the immediate prices for what the future prices are going to be, right? You pay the guy now and understand that future players are going to end up getting more, and that over time, then that player's contract will look better as the other contract values go up. And so you pay Ogunjobi now, jumps him to the highest paid of those sort of second tier defensive tackle type players, but understanding that some of the more up and coming younger players that end up getting their next deals, thinking like Ed Oliver from Buffalo, among others, they're likely going to jump above that. And so it does feel like a lot for Ogunjobi, but it's about where the market would be, right? Just launching him just in front of DJ Reader from the Cincinnati Bengals, just ahead of Javon Hargrave, who I mentioned, and then now a few $1 million ahead of the likes of Dalvin Tomlinson and Grover Stewart. It is important to mention that the Colts were paying Grover Stewart $10.25 million and DeForest Buckner $21 million at those defensive tackle spots. Very clearly, they invested a lot of money and draft picks in terms of trading for DeForest Buckner, trading and then salary money into those defensive tackle spots. So it shouldn't be, therefore, as surprising that Larry Ogunjobi goes out and gets that type of money from the Bears and that they put that type of a priority on signing him, because we've talked a little bit throughout the offseason so far that there aren't a lot of other like great defensive tackle prospects. And I wouldn't have necessarily included Ogunjobi as like the top of the list there in terms of, guys that jump out at you right away as guys you want to make sure you go out and sign, right? It's not a deep, robust group of young ascending players. And Ogunjobi is at least, entering his prime and can give you more than just, right, a couple of seasons, right? The idea is that the Bears have shed some salary this year and shed some good players to build more toward the long-term future. And Ogunjobi can be part of that at just age 27 right now. Even though the deal's a 3-year deal, right? He has the potential to be a potential longer term piece in this defensive line if he pans out the way they want him to. But your other options were like, of course, Akeem Hicks, Bilal Nichols, who feels like now with this Ogunjobi deal, maybe a little bit less likely. Certainly that Akeem Hicks comes back, that one's pretty much out of the window. For Bilal Nichols, it might depend on what the contract value is. Like we just said, the Colts had 2 very highly paid defensive tackles, and I think you don't rule out the possibility that the Bears could also pay Bilal Nichols pretty good money and make Ogunjobi and Nichols their defensive tackle combo. They also still have Angelo Blackson, Kyrus Tonga, and Mario Edwards can play that interior defensive tackle spot too. So it'll be interesting to see if they want to spend more there. But the other options were not great, right? Calais Campbell, BJ Hill from the Bengals, who I think they re-signed, DJ Jones from the 49ers, Linval Joseph from the Chargers, Sebastian Joseph Day from the Rams, Malik Collins from Houston, we've talked about, Sheldon Richardson from the Vikings, we've talked about in there too, even like Maurice Hurst from the 49ers, who I think they also ended up re-signing him. But not a robust free agent class of interior defensive linemen. And so that's why I think Ryan Poles goes out and says, okay, this is the one position that we are going to spend on a little bit here. And we are going to, as he used his own words in the previous segment, right, overpay for day one free agents, understanding that it's important to this defense and it's important to what they want to build on Matt Eberflus' side of the ball. The criticism there being that I think a lot of us would like to see them instead overpay on the other side of the ball and more directly build around Justin Fields. Not that adding to the defense isn't helping Justin Fields, but right, I think a lot of us wanted to see maybe you spend that money on an offensive lineman, or maybe you spend that money on a wide receiver, and you end up maybe going a little bit cheaper at defensive tackle and spending a little bit more on those more like directly closer to Justin Fields type positions. But clearly the Bears are staking their importance on, nope, 3 technique defensive tackle, maybe the nose tackle spot too. This is where it's important for this defense and where we're going to spend our money to open up the first day of free agency. I think it's also important not to overreact, to say, okay, the Bears spent some money here, so therefore the rest of the positions aren't going to be addressed properly. No, it's too early to say. Maybe, once we get through free agency, then we can criticize and say, instead of signing Ogunjobi, the Bears should have signed this player, this player, this player. But let's at least see what the rest of their free agent plan is going to look like before we lose all faith in Ryan Poles just yet. For now, he's kind of navigating what the rest of this free agent market looks like. And we've seen some other players get some pretty massive deals that maybe the Bears were interested in to a certain price point, and Poles seems to have held firm on a couple of key guys. We'll look at some of the other signings and how that sets the market for other positions the Bears may be going after next on Locked On Bears. Free agency is such a wild time with so many different moving parts. It can be hard to keep track of, but I'll tell you what, the one place where it's easy to keep track of moving parts is our friends at rockauto.com. They are perhaps the online's biggest retailer of auto parts, and tell you what, they have a catalog that is just so deep. They have anything you could possibly need for your vehicle. Parts I don't quite fully understand, like engine control modules, but otherwise easy stuff too, like tail lamps, brake parts, motor oil, even new carpet. So anything you need for your vehicle, Rock Auto is the place to do it. A lot of like the local chain part stores in your town, you'll go in, you'll talk to the guy behind the counter. They'll ask you all these really like intimidating questions, trying to see if you know what you're talking about. They go look in the back. They don't have it. They have to order it for you anyway. And then all of a sudden you're paying a middleman here. No. You can do it yourself so much easier at rockauto.com. Their catalog is so easy to navigate. You just enter in your car's make and model, and boom, pulls up all the different parts for your vehicle. Don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Head on over to rockauto.com today. See all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, write in the words "locked on" in the little box that says, "How did you hear about us?" That's going to be the best way to let them know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. It's been quite a selection of free agent signings to kick things off on the opening of the NFL's early negotiation window, the so-called legal tampering, as many people will call it. We weren't sure that the Bears would be super active. I didn't think the Bears would be all that active. They proved us wrong with Larry Ogunjobi. And as of the time I'm recording this, which is always a dangerous game, so far that's been the only major acquisition by Chicago. Again, perhaps by the time you're listening to this, a lot more will have certainly happened. We'll just see whether it involves the Bears or not. But some really big deals went down with some of the top name free agents to start. And it sets the market at a couple of key positions I think the Bears have been interested in. Some of these players the Bears were rumored to be pursuing, some of them probably never in the Bears' price range. Let's start with wide receiver Christian Kirk to the Jacksonville Jaguars. 4 years, $68 million. $17 million a year for a promising young player in Christian Kirk, but like more so a slot receiver, right? Not a true like number one X type outside wide receiver. And $17 million a year is a heck of a lot of money for Christian Kirk, right? That's kind of like, that's about where, or a little bit above what the Bears were offering Allen Robinson last year. So now all of a sudden, okay, is the wide receiver market going to be particularly inflated if Christian Kirk is getting $17 million a year? I mean, presumably Allen Robinson should get more. I mean, he might not because he's coming off of such a down year, but in terms of like what he's proven as a player over his career, Allen Robinson's proven to be a better wide receiver thus far in the whole than Christian Kirk. And so that may throw things into a loop there. Curious to see if that drives up Devontae Adams' price for the Green Bay Packers with him on the franchise tag. That'll be fun to watch. But then, the Bears have been reportedly pursuing Marquez Valdez-Scantling, the current Green Bay, or I guess most recently the Green Bay Packers wide receiver. But he's kind of always been a number, I don't know, call him a number 3, number 4 type, right? The knock in Green Bay was that they had Devontae Adams and no one else, that Valdez-Scantling was not necessarily like good enough for Aaron Rodgers. And so there's a fear here that like, if Kirk is getting 17, you're going to pay Valdez-Scantling, $10, $11 million a year. And is he going to be that difference maker at wide receiver if he wasn't dominant with Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams in his own offense. That so some questions there, but Kirk setting that market particularly high at wide receiver, that may affect the Bears' ability at least to go after the top guys. Maybe they end up waiting a little bit more for those numbers to come down later in free agency. We'll see. The offensive line, interior offensive line market dried up really fast, and dried up not in terms of dollars, but in terms of players available. It thinned out real fast. Let's go that way, because you saw after Tom Brady came back to the Buccaneers, center Ryan Jensen agreed to terms with the Buccaneers to come back 3 years, $39 million a year. That's $13 million a year for him. Brian Allen goes back to the Rams at 3 years, $24 million. That's $8 million per. And those are about where those numbers were expected. 13 a year for a top center, maybe 8 for more of that second tier type center. And then at guard too, Brandon Scherf goes to the Jaguars. As of now, we don't have numbers on that deal, but it's going to be, market setting potentially for one of the best guards in football going to Jacksonville. But then more of that B tier that we talked about, Laken Tomlinson from the 49ers was a name we had floated out there as a really solid veteran. He goes to the Jets, 3 years, $40 million. That's 13 and a third a year, about the same price as Ryan Jensen for those playing along at home. And then like Alex Kappa goes from the Buccaneers, the guard, to the Bengals for 4 years, $40 million, about $10 million a year. So we're looking at that right now, what the market value is in that $10 to $13 million a year for a top quality starting guard / center in there, and you work your way down once you get to that second tier. So does that put James Daniels more in that, that 10 to 12 million a year, or is he where's he viewed in this mix? I would imagine as a young ascending recent draft pick that maybe pushing more that 13 plus, depending on what the market's going to look like and what Brandon Scherf ultimately pulls in there for Jacksonville. So offensive line, a little expensive, but again, it's about what the Bears spent on Larry Ogunjobi. So would you have rather spent the $13.5 million on Ogunjobi or on, say, Laken Tomlinson at guard? Or I guess you never had a chance on Ryan Jensen, and Brian Allen barely got to negotiate either. So maybe those aren't fair ones to say the Bears could have spent it on them, but some of these other guys were available for Larry Ogunjobi prices for the offensive line. Bears put their priority for now on defense, but they still have time to prioritize the offensive line there with perhaps multiple free agent signings and early draft picks, right? That's why you can't fully judge all the Bears' actions until they actually finish taking them. I'll also throw the cornerback position in here real quick. AC Jackson from the Patriots signs with the Chargers for $16.5 million a year. $1 million to go to the Chargers with Khalil Mack. Davis stays with the Buccaneers at 3 years, $45 million, a 15 million average. So 16.5 and 15 million for some of the top cornerback prospects or cornerback free agents. That's about the price tag you're looking for a running mate for Jalen Johnson. I'm guessing Bears are probably going to end up waiting that one out and going a little bit cheaper too, especially given what they spent on Larry Ogunjobi. I don't know that they have another big splash signing in them financially, but I think we're going to see them really prioritize that second and third tier of free agency and maybe do some significant additions here, not in terms of significant in terms of names, but just I think a lot of bodies and a lot of names, a lot of turnover going to be coming through in terms of quantity, a little bit more so than quality. There still will be some quality in there, but I don't predict the Bears are going to get they're going to be named offseason winner this year, winners of free agencies. I'm not predicting the Bears are going to be one of those teams. I think Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus are just trying to establish their foundation for both sides of the ball, get their guys and not so much the Ryan Pace guys in the building. And they don't really care about winning the offseason right now. They want to win the team building process so they can be even more primed for 2023 and beyond. That doesn't mean tanking, right? Larry Ogunjobi makes them better this season. They are trying to win games this season. They're not tanking in and throwing in the towel on this year, but it is about taking some of their lumps now and being willing to be more patient. That's what it is. It's not tanking. It's being patient and building more toward the future. You can be sure we'll have rapid free agent updates for you all week long, whatever the Bears end up doing, right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. If you're looking for your second listen, the Locked On NFL podcast is going to be breaking down all the free agent moves. Plus, the Peacock and Williamson show breaks down the league from the national perspective and gets you up to date on all the headlines you're going to need to know if you're keeping up with all of your favorite football teams. Later this week, we'll hear from our friends from Locked On Bengals on Larry Ogunjobi, and we can check in on all of the other free agents the Bears bring in. But in the meantime, I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast can help you understand and digest it a little bit more, and hopefully as a result, make it that much easier to bear down.